Jane Austen was one sassy teenager. A few weeks ago, I had family members from America visiting, so I got to play tour guide and we all took a road trip down to the beautiful city of Bath. If you've never been, I really recommend checking it out. There's amazing food, really good chocolate shops, and of course the architecture is so gorgeous and unique that the entire city is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Bath is most famous for the Roman baths, but it's also a place with a lot of literary connections. Jane Austen is the most famous writer associated with Bath, and I had a great time visiting the Jane Austen Center, which is located in one of the houses the author used to live in. In the gift shop, I spotted a little book that I haven't read for a long time, in fact, not since I was a teenager. It's The History of England from the Reign of Henry IV to the Death of Charles I by a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. This year on the show, I've been highlighting works of historical fiction. More often than not, historical fiction is intense or even sad. But this book is a fantastic example of how it can sometimes be hilarious. Jane Austen wrote this book in 1791 when she was only 16 years old. It's full of short, wildly inaccurate biographies of kings and queens of England with really cute illustrations by her little sister Cassandra. I say book, but it is fairly short. It only takes about 20 minutes to read the whole thing, but the length of a story shouldn't be what determines its value. The History of England showed me as a kid that you don't have to wait until you're a grown-up to become an author. It also introduced me to the concept of an unreliable narrator. Lots of fiction is told using an unreliable narrator. This is someone who's telling the story, but you can't quite trust everything that they're saying. This might be because they have some bias that they really can't overcome, or they might intentionally be trying to mislead the reader. In The History of England, Jane Austen took on the persona of someone who is low on information but strong on opinions. The narrator also gets easily distracted while telling the story, once even going, "Oh, that reminds me of this joke I heard this one time," when she's supposed to be telling the life story of a king of England. Her ignorant historian character is pro-Catholic, pro-French, pro-Scottish, and anti-Tudor, which would have been very amusing to Jane's family, who were English. Jane's dad was also a Protestant minister, so the young author intentionally adopted a completely opposite point of view from what she believed in real life. This is cool because it shows that Jane and her family weren't so uptight about the subject of religion that they couldn't handle a little good-natured joking about the subject. It also shows that even at this young age, Jane Austen was able to put herself into the minds of people who weren't like her. Later on, she'd be famous for the rich, developed characters that she'd put into her fiction, as well as the very subtle, bubbling sense of humor that goes through the stories. That's not what's on display here. This is the broad, boisterous, silly sense of humor that a teenager's going to have, but you can still see the roots of the great writer that's on her way. Despite the fact that this is youthful satire, that isn't to say that Jane didn't have some pretty impressive insights. In the section on Henry IV, she notes that he must have been married as he had 4 sons, but, quote, "It is not in my power to inform the reader who was his wife," end quote. This is showing off the ignorance of the narrative voice, but it's also a dig at the fact that in the 18th century, historians focused almost entirely on the contributions of men to history, ignoring what women had done. She also isn't afraid to be critical of her own country, saying that when Joan of Arc caused, quote, "such a row among the English, they should not have burned her, but they did," end quote. While Jane's pretending to be a total idiot here, in real life, she would have had to be very well informed about the history of the 100 Years' War in order to make this kind of statement. It's also interesting that she defends Joan of Arc, and maybe that's because, as a teenage girl, she would have been sympathetic to someone who is the same age as her when reading this history. What the History of England is really building toward, though, is a full defense of Mary, Queen of Scots. This cracks me up because while the book says that it's about English history, it really focuses on a woman who mostly lived in France, was Queen of Scotland, and only ever came to England as a prisoner. Jane also heaps lots of vitriol on Elizabeth I, which is funny because she's generally the most admired monarch in English history. When you read this book, be sure to find the original illustrations by Cassandra Austen. I included these images in my reading of the history of England, which I'll link in this video. The portraits of the kings and queens are intentionally anachronistic and very non-royal. Every figure is presented in the clothing of Jane Austen's time, and all of them look like middle or even working class people. Henry VII looks like a scruffy workman, and my favorite is Mary Tudor, who is drawn as a dowdy little housewife. Elizabeth is shown as a pompous, hideous woman covered in lace and feathers with lots of pockmarks on her face, and Mary Queen of Scots is, of course, presented as an angelic and sweet-faced lady. Teenagers will enjoy reading the history of England just for the fun of it, but they'll also learn some pretty important concepts while they do. Jane Austen couldn't have written this satirical false history unless she actually understood the real one. And although she wrote this book just to have a laugh, it can also be used to introduce kids to the idea that not all historians are reliable, and that they shouldn't automatically trust a book just because it has the word history in the title. After reading the history of England, maybe your kids will want to write their own satirical, funny biographies of famous figures from history, complete with anachronistic portraits. By playing around with history and historical fiction, they can learn about the biases that writers often have, but in a fun way. Have you read The History of England by Jane Austen? What'd you think of it? Which biography was your favorite? Let me know.